In this final video on the Sewn board binding, we'll look at two covering styles. I'll cover a tight back binding where I'll use some thin leather to cover a link stitch sewn book, and then I'll do a one-piece full cover. A very much optional extra is gilding the edges of the books. This is more of an ad for an upcoming video on edge gilding, and I'd never gilded two edges at once, so I decided this was an opportunity to give it a go. I was inspired by Sam Ellenport. Back in the days when he owned and ran Harcourt Binderies, he would gild many books at a time, and I think in one of his videos there's a clip of him lowering a stack of books about 18 inches high into a gilding press. It's quite unbelievable. There are many small variations in edge gilding. The approach I'm following here comes from Jen Lindsay's book, Fine Bookbinding, and that's the approach I'll be following in the full video on this subject. I find this technique to be slightly easier and is probably the best way for people starting out with edge gilding. The first book I'll cover is the tight back. I'm using a block that I sewed with the 4 link stitch locations, and these will show through the leather like pseudo bands. I want leather that's about 1/2 millimeter thick, and I've separated this out into a separate video. However, you can buy splits from Hewitts and Tallis about this thickness that will just work fine without needing any pairing. And I also looked at some pseudo leathers, and I think most of those are thin enough to use as is. I don't think you can thin those anyway, I'm not sure. So I want the leather to wrap around about 30 millimeters onto the book. So I just mark that, and from that I'll be able to get the width of the leather that I need. The leather is a bit taller than the text block, and I will trim that after I've glued it to the spine of the book. For convenience, I'm going to use PVA. I tested on a scrap of leather and the PVA didn't strike through, so I'm not worried about wetting out the leather or anything like that. Once I've applied the leather to the book, I'm going to let it dry for a good few hours. I don't want the leather popping off the spine. Now, I did make a mistake on this book, and it has a bit of a concave spine. I forgot to put the end papers on the outside sections. I realized while I was sewing the book, so I was able to put the last end paper on before I sewed that section on, but I added the first end paper after sewing, and there just wasn't room for it, and it caused the spine to go a little bit concave on one side. So I'm just going to call that a reference to James Brockman's famous concave spine. If you haven't heard of it, just look it up. Since I don't have to open the book to do this, I'm going to go ahead and do the filling in on the outside of the boards. Now, this fill-in isn't quite the same thickness as the leather. It's a little bit off, but it's close enough. I'll use a scalpel to trim the leather at the head and tail of the spine, being really careful that I don't shave off the gilt edge on my boards, which is one of the features that I was aiming for. So this is the first time I'll open the book, so I'll do the usual thing of opening it like a new book, just so I don't put a crease in the spine. I'm going to use the same cloth that I used last week, even though it's a little bit repetitive, but the gold and blue just matches this book so well, I couldn't help myself. Now the question is how much of the spine leather to leave exposed. I sort of wanted to go for not very much, but then I was going to cover up the top edges of the boards which are now gilt. So I decided to compromise and sort of keep it thin but leave some of that board visible. So I've gone for 15 millimeters. Now if I hadn't gilt the top of the boards, then I'd have probably gone less, maybe even 5-10 millimeters. I lightly scored a line at 16 millimeters, and when I put the cloth down, I'll put it over that line so it's hidden. And the rest of the book is just following the usual steps of doing the turn-ins and putting down the end papers. For the final book, I wanted to do a one-piece cover, and I had a particular cover material in mind for this. I have this paste paper that you do by folding the paper in half and then pulling it apart at the corners to get a sort of a radial pattern. The pattern isn't quite as curved as I'd hoped, but it's okay. So I wanted to use it on this book. And I also wanted to do the spine lining slightly differently, especially for the covering of the edges of the boards. So last night I stained a piece of the same Japanese tissue that I've been using to line the spines with some acrylic paint. Just mix some paint up to try and match the colour. It doesn't have to be the same colour, you could go with a contrasting colour, but in this case I wanted to try and match it. So this piece of paper wraps around 30 millimeters onto the boards with about a 15 millimeter turn in, and the trick is just to try and center it. So I just put some marks to help me with that centering process. I'll put the adhesive on the spine of the book and then put it down on this new secondary spine liner. I'm also going to cut a spine stiffener at this point, but the spine stiffener will be used on the paste paper and not with the tissue. I'll apply the adhesive to the spine of the book, and then I'll present the book to the tissue, and then I'll stamp it down using the brush technique. And then once that's firmly adhered, then I'll cut little notches the width of the spine and then apply adhesive to each of the side flaps and turn the turn ends over the top of the boards. When cutting the notches, the width of the spine, I'll actually cut those to about even with the inside of the boards so that it covers the boards right to the ends. If there's excess material, you can trim it up. Applying the cover material is fairly straightforward, though I've made it more complex by having a design that I want centered exactly on the spine. So I'm just going to mark some guidelines, the width of the turn in, then I'll mark the line that is the center of the pattern, and I'll work out from that. So I'll want to glue the spine stiffener exactly centered on that line. And now marking in the breakaway points for the spine. Now there is a slight design flaw in this book. I'd originally thought that I was going to have the breakaway points corresponding to the width of the tissue paper that I lined the spine, but I decided that was too wide, so I end up with the spine lining being outside the breakaway point, and you can feel that spine lining. I thought it was going to be thin enough that you wouldn't feel it, so I probably should have filled in the boards, but I didn't. So that's probably a slight design flaw in this book. Now I'm just cutting a notch where the turn-ins for the breakaway are going to be. So I'm just going to crease those before I glue in the spine piece, just to make sure that they're the right height. Then I'll go ahead and glue the spine piece, put it in place, and then glue the turn-ins. Now crease the covers at the edges of the spine stiffener and just make sure that it fits the book. And once you're comfortable with the fit, apply a line of adhesive on the outside of the line that marks the breakaway point and apply the cover to the book. I'll trim the 4-edge turn-ins to 15mm, and then I'll complete the turn-ins in the usual manner and then put down the end papers, and that will complete this book. This completes the series on the Sewn board binding. I hope the thing that you take away from this series is that based on a fairly straightforward binding structure, there is a lot of scope for creativity in the covering style, and that I hope the 5 examples that I've provided give you options for stamping your personality on your books. I hope you've enjoyed this series of videos, and as always, I really appreciate you hitting the big thumbs up button. If you want to be notified of my future videos, please hit the subscribe button, and until next time, cheerio.